WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Showalter, if the end would come for Dan Duquette. And lo and behold, on Wednesday afternoon, the information sort of seeped out fast and furious. Luke Jones joins us now. He, of course, has been our Orioles reporter, Orioles historian. This is one of those sort of fractured eras of Oriole history. And, Luke, we knew changes were coming, or at least we believe changes should be coming on a team that lost 115 games. I don't think anyone thinks Buck Showalter is the village idiot on the way out the door, and I have penned a Dear Buck letter out at WNST.net. The Duquette thing, however, just shows that bad information is everywhere when you listen in and around the warehouse, because it was sort of commonly held belief that he was coming back, right?
Well, there were people who thought, Bob Nightingale a couple weeks ago reported that it was expected he was going to be extended, but I said to you at the time, let's wait and see on that. And I think there was so much confusion just based on how the trade deadline played out and the fact that Dan Duquette served as the voice of the Orioles at that point in time. And, he said good things, talked about the need to put more into scouting and to be more involved in the international market and all those different things that people have been clamoring for. He expressed those thoughts. And the one thing about it that we took pause over was, well, it's great to hear that.
But he doesn't have a contract.
The man delivering that message was only under contract for a couple more months. And that's where you kind of pump the brakes and you're thinking, okay, maybe this had shifted. Because keep in mind, back in April, before this got to historically poor proportions, I think the common thought among many people who covered the team, among Orioles fans, among media, was that Dan Duquette would probably be gone after 2018 and Buck Showalter would stay, knowing the relationship he had with Peter Angelos, knowing the goodwill he had built up here, even with the 2016 wildcard game. And then there was that sense midway through the season that it had kind of flipped, that sentiment had flipped. So I don't think it was I don't think people should have ever thought it was a foregone conclusion that Dan Duquette was going to return, but certainly at the end here over the last couple months, it had shifted to the point where it felt like Buck was gone and Dan had a chance to stay in some capacity, whether he was going to continue to be in charge of baseball ops, or at least, have that title of being in charge of baseball ops, or being reassigned to kind of head up international scouting, something that he had a lot of success with in past stops playing the international market. But ultimately, the axe fell on him too. So, you kind of come back to what you just said. When you have a 115-loss season, no matter what the overall legacy is for someone, and I've said this over and over, I think when it's all said and done and when we move further away from this period, and specifically this season that was so historically poor, I still think the overall tenure of Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette should be favorable, should be positive. When you look at the overall lack of success, not just during the Peter Angelos era, but since 1983, we're talking about a 35-year period. When you look at what the success that they brought from 2012 through 16 specifically, that's the most extended period of prosperity the Orioles have had over the last 35 years. So I think it was time. I am in full support of deciding to move on. The big question now becomes, who do you hire, and is that person put in a position where they can accurately and truly do their job? If you do those things, then you're heading back in the right track. You're heading back in the right direction. But if you don't do those things, well, who knows what's going to happen over the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years.
All right, so big picture now is Brady Anderson's running the place, or they're figuring this out, or when's the press conference, Luke? When do we get to ask questions, and who's the one answering them? Who fired Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette, or made the decision to not renew them, or whatever, parting of the ways, whatever? Who is the one making the decision here?
Well, I think it's John and Lou Angelos. Now, which of them specifically? How much did they consult Brady Anderson or other members of the organization that they might have a trust in? It's hard to say. We know that how things operated under Peter Angelos, and it's become more and more accepted that the boys are running the show. Maybe not 100% necessarily, but they're running the show on most issues at the very least. So I think it's clear that they made decisions. I know that they met with Buck and Dan here recently, and now how they're going to go about hiring a new baseball ops person. I'll read directly from the release. It flat out says, and
but the release isn't signed by any human being, right? The release is this is what the Wizard is saying, the club is saying, right? It's not. There's no human being here, right?
Well, then, is it quoted specifically from one human being? The statement that's put out at the end of it is credited to Greg Bader representing the ownership, but
there's your first problem.
Well, but the overall
Greg Bader, he's doing the words. Great.
But the overall release says the club will hire an executive from outside of the organization to lead the baseball operations department. Once in place, this individual will have the final determination on all baseball matters that he or she believes will make the Orioles successful on the field, entertaining the fans, and impactful in the community. Now, that sounds good.
Yeah.
That's what it should be. But I'd also caution everyone that whether you're talking about Dan Duquette or Jim Beattie and Mike Flanagan or Andy McPhail or whichever executive has been in here at any different point, Pat Gillick, the Orioles never put out a release that said, well, this is our GM, but they're going to have to run things up the flagpole to get approval on certain issues and all of that. So, look, it sounds good. Just like what Dan Duquette said at the trade deadline, that sounded good as far as things that they needed to, changes they needed to make, resources that needed to be reallocated as far as into scouting, the international market, analytics, sports science, all the different things that teams are doing now that the Orioles, have kind of dabbled in. It's not that they've been completely absent from, but certainly need to put more resources in. But, the next part of the release, and this is where it kind of goes back to what you just asked, it mentions that Director of Scouting Gary Rasich, Vice President of Baseball Operations Brady Anderson, and Director of Player Development Brian Graham remain under contract. Now, does that mean they remain under contract for the 2019 season and perhaps beyond that? Or does that simply mean they're going to be the ones in charge in the interim? And it does mention Brian Graham is going to be he's going to oversee baseball operations in the interim period. So, it's kind of interesting that Brady Anderson's thrown into the middle of that almost by happenstance that he's included in that. But
the guy that wants to run the place but doesn't want a title but wants a role in everything.
Yeah.
And, he's in with the boys, but we're not sure which one of the boys and who he favors, and he's never seen anywhere, and he's never out in public, leading anything or holding, court with anyone. He doesn't even really live here, but he's the most significant guy, and everyone has told me that. Everyone that's been around the team says Brady's kind of sort of running things, and nothing happens around there without Brady knowing about it and at least talking to the boys about it. And that's what Buck and Dan are running from, I guess. And I keep saying Buck and Dan and Buck and Dan and Buck and Dan. Well, this is our last chance to talk about Buck and Dan. We won't have them to kick around anymore. The fans have destroyed Duquette, and I don't know how much or how little effect he really had on a lot of things that he would have wanted to do. And I inked Buck Showalter's Dear Orioles farewell, and everything about it is incomplete to some degree because Buck would have wanted the place to be better if he was running it, but he wasn't. And obviously 115 losses, it's easy to say it's now your problem and roll on. Look, Buck will get employed, and I think Dan will get employed too. I don't think Buck will be a manager again, and I don't know that Dan Duquette's ever going to be the president of the Toronto Blue Jays or any other baseball organization. I would think that their flower is a little wilted going out now as opposed to where they were 3-4 years ago when, as Duquette found out in Toronto, the getting was good. You're a genius when you win 100 games. When you lose 115 games, that sticks to you a little bit.
Sure, and it should stick to them, quite frankly. And to be very clear, to the point that you made about Brady Anderson, I'm not going to disagree with you. At the same time, I never got the impression that he was pulling all the strings. I think it was much more a case of he was in the loop on things, and if there were things that he had disagreements about, and this was chronicled by Ken Rosenthal about a year ago or so with some of the things that happened with Dom Chidi and Dave Wallace. There were instances of that, but
when Brady Anderson was acting as the pitching coach, that's really normal in an organization, isn't it?
And not so much that he was, that he would usurp. It's more so he was involved, and sometimes there could be disagreements there. Because I think if you do it, if you portray it that Brady was running the show, which I never got the sense that I wouldn't classify it as that, then that does absolve Buck Showalter and Dan Duquette. They have to wear it too. I mean, they both had missteps along the way, and that's not to say that they shouldn't be viewed favorably as far as their overall legacy, but there's definitely things that they did incorrectly, and part of it was just those two not being on the same page as much as they needed to be, most likely. And that's not to say you don't have disagreements. John Harbaugh and Ozzie Newsome disagree about things. Eric DeCosta and Ozzie Newsome disagree about things. You need to have discourse. You need to have disagreements because...
But there is a chain of command there.
Sure.
No one ever doubts that Ozzie runs the show around here.
Right. And that's where you come back to it and say, no matter how much... how much influence Brady Anderson might have had, and look, we've said it over and over, Brady's also done good things for the organization as well. It hasn't been an all-negative type of thing, but when you have someone like that who you ask the question, who does he answer to? And, by official title, it should be Dan Duquette, but we know in reality it wasn't really that way. Then it just creates confusion and it feeds more or into more conflict, and it just it's just not a good way to handle things. So the biggest question now is, and you can put out what how that statement reads, and it sounds good on paper, but whoever is hired, and they say they're going to hire someone outside the organization, which I think is a good thing. I think it's a good thing to hire someone and not just hand it all over to Brady Anderson and Brian Graham be his right-hand man, and they hire someone in the organization to be the manager. It's good to bring in someone outside, but at the same time, how much influence or how much control will that person truly have, and will Brady Anderson answer to that person, or will it be considered that Brady Anderson maybe moves into more of a president role that oversees everything but isn't in charge necessarily of the day-to-day? We'll see, and certainly that question needs to be asked and needs to be answered, and when we get that answer, who knows?
He is Luke Jones. We are Baltimore Luke out on Twitter, or he is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter. I'm Nestor on Twitter, and we're together out at WNST. And, of course, our morning newspaper delivers each and every morning to your email inbox, always brought to you by our friends at Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's always $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Also, the Maryland Jockey Club and our friends at Laurel. They are racing this weekend. Beautiful weather. It's a great weekend to go down and see the ponies. They'll have some baseball on the TVs down there. The sports book will be open. Go on down to Laurel Park. You haven't been there lately. Make sure you get down there. The Maryland Million on October the 20th as well. All of our coverage also brought to you by our friends at Sporticulture. The beautiful flowers that can be shipped to you, shipped anywhere, officially licensed. You can learn more at sporticulture.com, as well as Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast. Always the tasty Kona blend in this cup, and the fried chicken. Got to get some Western fries this weekend before I go to Cleveland. I'll be out in Cleveland doing all things Browns and Ravens on Sunday. Luke's staying behind on this one. He'll be out in Owings Mills all week long and, of course, monitoring whatever is happening with the Baltimore Orioles as they are now rudderless. What does this look like to you? And look, man, I've written a couple of books on this, and I went back and figured out who did the hiring when Phil Regan was in the room and who did the hiring when Lee Mazzilli was in the room. And Peter loved having lawyers involved in hiring managers back in the day. I'm not saying it's that now, and we've all been told that Peter is in some sort of, advanced state of not being able, it's all shrouded in secrecy. Peter's not involved. That's what we're told. I've learned to take what I'm told with a grain of salt by anybody with the Orioles, but I do wonder, this mystery man or woman who will be coming in to run the organization and be the director of baseball ops and all that, what does that interview room look like? Is that John and Lou and Brady? I mean, literally, I
Yeah.
They talked about John Vitelin 3 months ago, and as Tom Lavero pointed out in the Washington Times the other day, he's on a milk carton somewhere. I mean, nobody's heard from the guy who's apparently supposed to run the business part of this.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I mean, I would assume the three individuals that you mentioned, I would assume John Vitelin, in the same way that a Dick Cass would be involved when the Ravens, at the next point in time that they hire a general manager or a coach. It's kind of tough to go off that model because they've only hired coaches because Ozzie Newsome's been the guy for so long, and Eric DeCosta is going to succeed him. So, how much influence does that mean? Because Brian Graham and Gary Racich are, they mentioned specifically in the release that they remain under contract. Are they consulted? Because they're two guys that have been in baseball a long time. Are they consulted? Are they guys that work on maybe putting together candidates for them? I don't know. I mean, that's why ideally you have a press conference to kind of spell this out. And look, no one's going to expect you to pull back the curtain on every little piece of minutia and every little detail, but some kind of groundwork, some kind of framework that you're going to operate under in hiring a new general manager. You'd like to know that. And, we assume John and Lou Angelos and Brady Anderson are going to be, part of that. And maybe they talk to some other executives. If you recall, over the summer there was the mention of Ned Colletti as a potential candidate. But, I'd also heard that was more of a consultant kind of thing. Do they reach out to former executives for advice, potentially good candidates that might be recommended to them? I don't know.
They couldn't get good candidates when the old man was running the team. That's how Duquette wound up here. I mean, he was on a milk carton for 12 years. No one in the industry would come and take this job. And I think with the scuttlebutt of the team maybe being forced into a sale, what happens to Peter, what happens to the organization, the low ebb of the fan base here, certainly the low ebb of the talent base inside of the organization. Dan Duquette brought in 15 players now and will never be around to, much like Sid Thrift, pay the price for Jacobo Sequoia or be praised for Melvin Mora. All of that acting like he was in charge in the summer, it looked nice. I said it was like Weekend at Bernie's. They were propping him up, and I was right. It's October 5th and he's gone, right?
Well, but at the same time, in the same way that Andy McPhail was credited for a lot of what happened from 12 through 16, rightfully so, Dan Duquette can receive credit in that way. That's it's kind of the way it works. Very few executives and managers come into a situation and then leave going out on top. It just doesn't work that way 99% of the time. You're either forced out or you kind of maybe you decide on your own you're done. In that way, it's going to be very interesting to see how they operate. I think the point you make about Peter Angelos, the counterpoint is, well, if John and Lou are running the show now, and all indications are pointing to that, maybe there is an opportunity to bring in someone that's young. I think you have to be realistic in looking at where they are right now. I think they should be looking for an up-and-comer, someone who's young, someone that's number 2 or number 3 in command at a cutting-edge, good organization, whether you're talking Houston or whoever you want to talk about. That's kind
anywhere that's not here is cutting edge, kind of, sort of, right? Like 25 of the teams sort of operate the same way. Am I wrong? And in regard to analytics and in regard to modern baseball, in the way modern baseball is moving, shall we say, in the direction that Billy Beane and Theo Epstein took it. How about that?
I think it's a little more nuanced than that. The Orioles certainly haven't been the best organization. I think that's clear. They certainly need to get more cutting edge. But at the same time, if you look at where they were 5 or 6 years ago, what was the basis of the Orioles' success on the field? Great defense and bullpen. What do you see in Major League Baseball today? Two of the absolute pieces that are necessary to be a great team. And look, we can talk about velocity and different home runs and power and things like that, and the 3 true outcomes and fewer balls put in play. But you look at the best teams in baseball, they have put more of an emphasis on defense, which the Orioles did 5 or 6 years ago, and bullpen usage. I mean, it's way up. And Buck Showalter in the 2016 wild card games, look at how the playoffs have been transformed since that happened, how bullpen usage has changed almost overnight from the point that happened, and now that's trickled into the regular season. So it's not as though the Orioles haven't had times where they've been more cutting edge. It's just that they kind of were passed by over the last few years, and certainly the talent decayed on the field, and then other guys they traded away because they didn't want to lose them for nothing, obviously. But they certainly need to get more cutting edge. So, I mean, I put it this way, I wouldn't be looking to hire just anyone from some other organization. I think you should aim for the best candidates and look at the 5 or 10 organizations that you view to be the best, the most innovative, the most analytically inclined, and seek out their number 2, their number 3.
But this is the worst job in baseball, right? I mean, maybe this side of Tampa or some other places where you would not have resources. I mean, this is not a good job here. This is not a good situation. This is not a place that if you're number 2 or number 3, you're number 1 or you're number 2, or your parents or your spiritual advisor would say, why don't you wait for the next job? The Detroit job might be around the corner, or the Seattle job any job might be around the corner other than this job. I just think that you would be advised to not take this gig right now.
Well, I mean, but
well, Buck was advised not to take this job, and he took it, right?
It's always well and good to say that it's a bad job, but when there's only 2 of them out there, it's easier said than done to wait around and wait around and wait around, because there have been lots of guys who've waited around, and guess what? That window never opens again.
Sure.
How many hotshot coordinators do you hear about on an annual basis, and then their name kind of goes away? Why does that happen? Well, they didn't get a job at that point, and then that great offense or defense that they had falls apart the following year, and their name's never heard from again as a head coach candidate. So I think it's really...
Or Dan Duquette trying to be the president of the Blue Jays, right? Like, that opportunity might not come again for him.
I just think it's really easy to say that it's a bad job, but there's 30 of them. And I
just remember the last time around, a lot of people lined up in the last couple times to turn it down when Peter was running the team.
Right.
Now, if the boys bring people in and say, hey, we're better people, we're honest people, we're low-key people, we're not going to undermine you, we're not our father, we have this team here, it's important to us. I don't know, maybe they could sell somebody, but Peter couldn't. Peter couldn't sell anyone on this gig. Other than Buck and Dan.
And that's where I think there's unknown about this, where the unknown could be positive. I don't know that. We'll have to see how this plays out. First of all, I want to see just even who they want to interview. Are they looking for someone that's younger and is going to kind of grow into the job and be given the autonomy on 98% of issues? I mean, let's face it. I mean, if you're looking to sign a $100 million contract, any owner in baseball is consulted for big things like that. But everything else, the day-to-day, the waiver claims, the trades you want to make, scouts you want to hire, analytics you want to implement, and putting together an analytics staff and seeing how that's going to be married with the on-field staff and players. All of those things, you want to have a baseball ops guy who can truly execute all of those things. And if you truly present that opportunity to someone, then I think they absolutely can get someone really good. It's probably not going to be someone that people are overly familiar with, but I'd much rather see that than some retread like Ned Colletti, who I won't say can't be successful, but I don't think that's really moving the meter in a direction that you need it to, considering you need to get more cutting edge and you need to be more innovative, and you need to get back to a point where they were 5 years ago. They did have an edge over some teams because I think they saw the value in bullpen usage and defense that other teams maybe were missing the boat on a little bit. So it's going to be fascinating in that regard. And if nothing else, and this is one thing that I think was encouraging to see, if you notice in the release, there was no mention whatsoever of hiring a manager, and the hope is they're hiring a baseball ops person who will then lead the manager search and make the decision on hiring a manager.
Well, that would involve a flow chart, something that hasn't existed.
Done. And keep in mind, part of this whole Dan Duquette, Buck Showalter dynamic that always kind of put it off on the awkward foot, even though they made it work for a long time, was that Buck Showalter was already here. He had already been here for close to a year and a half by the time that Dan Duquette was hired. So that's backwards. You don't want it that way. That's why when you hear suggestions out there, and how much of it's speculative, how much of it's real, who knows? I think time will tell. The next several weeks will tell. But when you hear Mike Bordick's name thrown out there, and I have nothing against Mike Bordick personally whatsoever. I happen to think Mike Bordick is...
I love Mike Bordick, except on my TV 4 hours a night where he's working for Mr. Angelos, and my ears are bleeding because I'm not getting the truth. I'm getting, what Mike Bordick thinks that Peter Angelos wants to hear. I've same thing with Rick Dempsey, same thing with all of these people who have not really been honest with the fans and yet have this platform of some sort of higher knowledge. They know everything. They report very little. And the team lost 115 games, and they had to make excuses for it. And, if you're willing to do that, you're probably not going to be a very good manager. For me.
Well, I think that's debatable. I mean, being a broadcaster is different than being a manager. I mean, it just is.
Well, the credibility level of what is honest and what is... what our partner Brian Billick would call filtered information, right? I mean, filtered or unfiltered information. The unfiltered information is this organization's a disgrace, and they lost 115 games, and it's been run shabbily, but it's been deodorized by some good players and some good decisions that were made almost a decade ago by Andy McPhail, where the Machados and the Davises and the Tillmans and the Markakises and the Weeders blossomed and Adam Jones blossomed for a period of time, and then there's nothing on the other side of that because this was a paper monster at heart. It was still an organization run by Peter Angelos that was completely dysfunctional over the last 3 to 5 years, really, with Brady Anderson's involvement, with Dan Duquette wanting to get out the side door, with various issues with Chris Davis and how much money he took up versus other players, and decisions to not bring Cruz back, and decisions to jettison Miguel Gonzalez over a couple $1 million, and just all of it leads to 115 games, and people here should be pissed. I don't even know if people are as pissed as they should be. If the Ravens were 2-14 a couple of years, people would be pissed. With the Orioles, I don't know. They've always had a different bar here, in the modern era, because of who runs them. That, being good was good enough for them, and it's disgraceful to me, but I am interested in because I've covered all this for 30 years, I'm interested in what happens next. What happens when Peter dies or goes away with the boys, with Major League Baseball? There's a lot of conjecture that Major League Baseball is going to come in some sort of a hostile takeover and say, boys, here's the buyer, here's the check. Do you want it or do you not? And if you don't, you're going to play on the West Coast every other week. You're never going to get an all-star game. We're not sending anybody down to help you make money. A matter of fact, we'll even help the Nationals if we want. We'll give them some money from the side kiddie pool, which they did. So all of this stuff is going on behind all of this, and now the Orioles have to go out and rebuild something where we don't even know who's running the place. There's no human being still out in front of even firing Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter to shake their hand, pat them on the back, and say thanks, and say, all right, I'm in charge now. Instead, it's Greg freaking Bader releasing words that are empty with no human being behind it. It's disgraceful. It makes me itch.
But the words are empty until actions are implemented anyway. Believe me, I've said over and over, I think there would have been great value going back to even May or June to have John and or Lou Angelos get in front of cameras. Masson can broadcast it live, have reporters there to ask questions, and really see what the heck the vision is going to be for this organization moving forward, presumably with them in charge and Peter Angelos not being at the forefront anymore, and seeing when that official transfer of power is going to take place in the same way that that's happened with other organizations recently. I believe me, I see that, but at the same time, ultimately this comes down to actions. How many years have we heard the Ravens talk about building up an offense, and they didn't do it for a number of years until this year, and finally we're seeing the roots. And look, I'm not saying that the Orioles are on par with the Ravens. I'm just saying as an example words can be really empty.
Well, they're going to go out and play 162 games next year. I mean, somebody's going to have to go out and do this, and it will be judged by people like us every day, right? Because that's what we do. So whatever they do, I'm fascinated to see it. I just don't have a lot of confidence in it because I don't like the initial parts of this. I ask if these guys were Rocky or Bullwinkle. Right now, that's a Bullwinkle act. Throwing Duquette and Showalter out the door, and no one in the city still knows who's running the place. It's disgraceful. And putting Greg Bader's name on it, who's a goof, disgraceful.
Well, how did you want them to handle that?
Have a press conference. Have a press conference and stand there and answer questions and honestly have someone, a human being, in front of this. Just a human being that if it's Brady, that's cool. Put Brady in a suit.
Lots of teams fire coaches and general managers and they don't have them at
lots of teams that lose 115 games and have no corporate sponsors and nobody coming to the games. And the Washington Nationals 38 miles to the south. The other teams don't have that problem.
But my point is when you fire a general manager and coach, very rarely do you have a press conference to say goodbye to them.
No, I understand that.
You have a press conference with the person, the owner in this case, because who else would there be? Or if you want to make it Brady Anderson, make it Brady Anderson then. But I agree with you. There should be a press conference, and if they have one next week to say we're going to talk about our search and what we're looking for, great. If they don't, then it's another missed opportunity. But ultimately, press conferences are press conferences. And even if you hold press conferences, you're not getting the whole truth most of the time anyway. So ultimately, and I'm not saying there isn't value to that because I agree with you on that, but ultimately the actions are what matters, and we will see who they hire. I'll say this, and we haven't really talked too much about the field manager, and I'm not really interested in who they hire as the manager right now, quite frankly, because honestly, who they're hiring right now is going to be Dave Tremblay. And what I mean by that is it's someone who's not going to win. It's someone who, let's face it, has a very small chance of still being the manager when this team is hopefully ready to contend 4 years from now or whenever it is.
Is Jack McKeon available? Lou Piniella? Can we get one of those guys?
And when I say this, I don't want it to, but I'll say I don't want it to be Dave Tremblay in the sense of a baseball lifer who's a little longer in the tooth. I would like to see a younger manager who is on board with analytics, who is going to relate to young players, and has a knack for teaching young players and motivating them. They're going to lose a lot of games the next couple of years, even if they make brilliant hires, even if you find the next Theo Epstein and Joe Madden to run your organization. They're still going to lose a lot the next couple of years. I mean, that's just the reality of it. It's going to take time, even if every decision they make moving forward from today is a home run. So as far as the manager, I hear people talk about, throw out all these names like Joe Girardi. No, stop. I would much rather see a younger manager, first-time manager who relates to players well, is going to be on board with baseball ops from an analytics standpoint, which Buck Showalter always talked a good game about analytics, wasn't really as analytically inclined as I'd like him to be, and I think the Zach Britton wild card game was a perfect example of that. So really what we're seeing the model in baseball becoming more and more is the general manager or head of baseball ops or executive vice president of baseball operations or whatever title you give your guy that's running the show in the front office. They're in charge, and the manager, it's far less of a partnership now as it's kind of traditionally viewed, and it's much more that the field manager is kind of middle management and is someone that's there to execute what the general manager wants. And that's what I'd like to see. And I'd be perfectly fine with it being someone that most Orioles fans haven't really heard of. And, but is it someone that is younger? Because I think that's going to be a key. I think that was one thing that was going to be problematic if you were going to decide to keep Buck Showalter. Yeah, this is a man in his early 60s, and I think him trying to relate to players in their early 20s, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think that's optimal. So hire someone younger, hire someone who's up with it when it comes to analytics, and is going to be on the same page as baseball, whoever's running baseball ops, and what you hope will be an analytics staff. And that there's a communication there, there's a bridge there to take those numbers and take it to the field. It's been very apparent. I've seen interviews from Kevin Gaussman and Zach Britton in the last few weeks that talked about how their new organizations, the use of analytics and how that's relayed to players is so much different than how it was in Baltimore. They just say it's night and day. Not to say the Orioles haven't used analytics, but I don't think they've used it to their full advantage. And certainly there's been a disconnect between people that have used analytics in the organization and relaying that to coaches and players executing that. And look, I mean, it's not that you're trying to memorize all these numbers, but where can you gain an edge? Why are we shifting? Why are we positioning our outfielders in this way? And, I think that there's been, at times some pushback, some disconnects there that other organizations don't have, and I think you're missing out on creating more of an advantage for yourself. So give me that manager that's younger, that's hungrier, that's eager to work with young players, that understands that, hey, you're probably not going to win a whole lot the next couple of years, and that's okay, by the way. We're going to be behind you in that way. We don't expect you to turn water into wine. Like, we're not expecting a miracle. Just show up, work hard, implement what we're doing as an organization, relate to players, and be a good teacher, and assemble a staff that will do that. And if you do that, I'll be fine with it. And it doesn't need to be the next Casey Stengel. It doesn't need to be someone that, it doesn't need to be the next Tony La Russa. If you find the next Tony La Russa by accident, great. But to me, the field manager that's pretty far down on the list right now as far as... Well,
in modern baseball, he doesn't have a whole lot of, latitude anyway. In a modern organization, as we found out in Washington, the manager doesn't matter, right? I mean, anybody can go in there and just manage the analytics. I mean, that's the way the Lerner family felt about it, right? I mean, that's the Billy Beane model where the GM sort of runs the design of how a game flow goes, right?
Well, the manager matters, and that's one thing that I will push back on a little bit.
Well, it certainly mattered with Buck. I mean, a lot it mattered here.
Yeah, right. And that's one thing I'll push back from as far as, people that are more analytically inclined, and, they'll say, well, a manager, how much influence do they really have? And, look, I think it's overrated most of the time, how much influence the manager has. I mean, we talk about Buck Showalter, the one time that it was so plainly slap you in the face obvious was Zach Britton in the wild card game. And sure, there were plenty of other instances where you can debate moves here and there, and there were moves that I didn't like over the last couple of years, certainly. But there were also plenty of games that he just put players in position, and it was up to how the player performed. There were times he made the right move, and the player doesn't perform. So I think the manager gets too much credit when the team wins, and too much blame when they lose. But that doesn't mean that they don't have influence and they're not important. But I just think where the Orioles stand right now, knowing that the Major League roster is going to be lacking, to put it kindly, for the next year or two at the very least, I just think the field manager is, it's much lower on the priority list right now. I'm so much more intrigued to see, first of all, who they hire. Second of all, does that, as general manager, how much power does that person truly have? What kind of resources do they give them to sign a scouting department, put together an analytics department, put together a presence in the international market, which, as we've talked about, isn't just something that you throw money to. It's something that you have to plan and leave your footprint from a really kind of a networking standpoint in Latin America. Those things take time, and you need to have someone that's going to be willing to work and someone that has a good vision. And you hope John and Lou Angelos have learned from mistakes of their father that they'll give this person an opportunity to do the job. Offer support, offer resources, be a sounding board, whatever, but let that person do their job. And the big question in that, as we mentioned, especially the way he was kind of just tucked into the release, how does Brady Anderson fit into that equation? And until we have an opportunity to ask questions about that.
Why do they hide him? Why do they hide him in this way? Like, I don't know the benefit of that. You know what I mean? Like, it's been written about for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
That's That's the embarrassing part. What are you hiding from? I mean, if Brady's running the place, put him in a suit. He's had a million microphones in his face. Chicks dig him for whatever reason. Let him go be arrogant in his arrogant way out in front of everyone and look like he's in charge. It would be very Trumpian to some degree to put him out in front and prop him up and let number 9 lead the way. And, I mean, there are fans that would get behind that. But he is reluctant to do that.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, and what's not to say, and look, I'm just saying hypothetically, I have no idea if this model would work or not. And look, I think Brady's smart. I think Brady is someone who has studied up on analytics, and he knows a ton about nutrition and certainly cares and, is around and has done good things. But
doesn't want any of the accountability of all of it, right?
Well, and that's where you kind of come back to. But hypothetically speaking, if you hired Brady Anderson to be your president, let's say, kind of the role that they wouldn't give Dan Duquette, but they decided they were going to go in a different direction as far as their overall structure, and then hired a general manager that's going to oversee all of the day-to-day and baseball ops, and they'll answer to Brady, but it's understood that, hey, Brady's not an experienced general manager. In a way that you look at the Phillies right now, Andy McPhail is at the very top, but Matt Klentak is their general manager. And by most accounts that I see, and look, I don't follow the Phillies every single day, but it sounds like Matt Klentak makes decisions there. So it's not something that would be unheard of to do that. And at the very least, there would at least be the appearance of a chain of command rather than this, Brady's doing this and doing this and doing this, which, I've talked about I've talked about this to you before. There are lots of teams that have a hybrid guy or two that kind of acts as a liaison between different departments, but you need to have a chain of command, and ultimately they need to answer to someone, and that's where the problem and the questions have been, where they've been at this point. So, do we get any clarity on that? Time will tell, and what they say isn't necessarily what reality is, but at the very least, based on what the release says, the Orioles are going to hire a baseball ops person from outside the organization, and we will see where that goes over the next few weeks. Hopefully they hire a good person. Hopefully they'll get out of the way and let that person do the job, and hopefully that person will be able to hire a manager. That's the way it should work, but we know that hasn't always been the order of operations for this organization over the last 2 decades or so.
Our partner Brian Billick said, take the leap of faith back in the day with Scott Mitchell. I don't anything with the Angelos family, the leap of faith part goes with my eyeballs. It's kind of like this goof run in the country. I don't need any media member to tell me. The actions, the words, the deeds are there. They're there to be seen. It's very transparent, and even though they don't want this to be a transparent process, people like you and me are going to be talking about it every day and paying attention to it. And the Ken Rosenthals of the world and the reporters of the world will all be running around with the Yankees and the Red Sox this week. And the Cubs are out now. And here come the Dodgers and the upstart Milwaukee Brewers and whatnot. There'll be plenty of baseball to be watched. So they can sort of do this under the cloak of darkness over the next 3 or 4 weeks and interviewing people and doing whatever they're doing. I don't know that there's a lot of reporters really sniffing around that if these guys were to sneak people in and out of town, I don't know that Baltimore is on edge worrying about who's going to replace Buck Showalter right now, especially with the 3-1 Ravens playing in Cleveland this weekend. But the next month, let's see how they operate. And I'm not going to lower my bar for them. If they're not conducting this thing in a professional way and bringing in professional people, and they prop up Mike Bordick to be the manager or Rick Dempsey or whatever, then we'll judge it for what it is, right?
Well, ultimately, actions speak louder than words. That's why I said what's in a press release or what would be said in a hypothetical press conference.
If Greg Bader said it, I don't believe it. Let's start with that because he's lied about me enough. So, I have a hard time believing that. And if he's still the guy who's issuing the press releases, you've got an effed up organization to not have leadership there, to not have someone out in front of it, and I'll continue to go back to that. But, that's my axe to grind here in the coming months on a team that just lost 115 games. People should be angry about this. But, Luke, We have more breath for this later, I'm sure. We got a football game in Cleveland this weekend. Luke is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net out on Twitter. He is a very available individual. We are very available individuals on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. And don't forget, the buyatoyota.com audio vault is there for you 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn radio app. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570. And WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.